Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Pastor. This week's questions come from Mark Tauzin. He asked two questions. The first one is, if families are gathered together at home and have bread and wine, are you able to give a blessing so that they may distribute it to their families? And the second related question is, also, would there be any kind of parking lot drive-by communion? Those are two excellent questions, and I'll take them in turn. The first question, I'll give you a bit of background and history. Back in March, as we were all scrambling to envision what exactly a communal life, a worship life would look like in a time of pandemic, we began to talk among ourselves as clergy and try to decide what online worship opportunities could offer us and how we could faithfully and appropriately celebrate the Lord's Supper, the resurrection meal, by distributing either pre-consecrated hosts or by hosting a remote or drive-by communion. Now, my colleagues in actuality were split on that. Some argued that it would simply be inappropriate to do a remote online service of Holy Communion because Holy Communion, the Eucharist, which means a sacrifice of prayer and thanksgiving in Greek, is first and foremost a communal act. So if you can't physically gather together as a community, you can't engage in a communal act. Therefore, Holy Communion, the Eucharist, should be reserved for a time when we can gather and kneel together again at the rail. Others contended, as we spoke among ourselves, that we do indeed make allowances for communion in special circumstances. Say, for instance, when I take communion and celebrate it with those who are in the hospital, or when our Eucharistic ministers pick up their communion kits with the pre-consecrated or pre-blessed elements in them, and then they take them to the homebound. Other people argued for a plague fast from the sacrament. That is, during these times, the church should engage in a form of penitence, and a church should fast until a more appropriate time. Others pointed out that yes, it is one thing to engage in a fact, but it's quite another thing to starve yourself. And before we had satisfactorily solved these issues for ourselves, we received our letter from the bishop citing an ELCA document which was adopted by the 5th Biennial Convention of the ELCA on August 19th, 1997. The document is called The Use and Means of Grace. It was intended to bring our 16th century confessional Orthodox Lutheran theology up to date because, say, the Reformers really didn't anticipate things, modern communication technologies such as television and the internet. And we wanted to be able to address some of the questions that our postmodern age was asking of us. Now, the use and the means of grace is included as an addendum to this book, The Sunday Assembly, which is a liturgical guideline for congregations. And it specifically mentions principle number 39. And I'll read that principle. It's entitled, The Holy Communion Takes Place in the Assembly. The gathered people of God celebrate the sacrament. Holy Communion, normally celebrated within a congregation, also may be celebrated in synodical, church-wide, and other settings where the baptized gather. Now, the bishop's letter referenced this principle 39 in the document, The Use and the Means of Grace, and counseled us not to do remote Holy Communion wherein we distribute the elements to people or ask people to gather bread and wine at home, and then we bless it remotely through the internet. The bishop did comment, though, that the Council of Bishops was also meeting with our confessional theologians to see if there is some wiggle room there. But for the time being, we were asked simply not to do this because of our understanding as Holy Communion as a communal act. So that's the answer for the time being. I'm certain, like many other theological issues within the church, this is not a done deal, and we will see a variety of practices occur across the ELCA. Now, as to your second question, will we be able to celebrate communion as part of our drive-in church? The answer to that is simply yes. And this is what we're going to ask people to do. As our church leadership has been meeting via video conferences on Zoom, we ask ourselves some very hard questions of how can we distribute the sacrament in a way that is simultaneously faithful to the tradition of the church and also safe in the time of a global health crisis. We decided against having any one person or groups of persons distribute the sacrament to everyone individually, as we worried about sterile fields and how can we accomplish this without potentially harming people. Now, I know we have a propensity to say, well, God wouldn't create a sacrament that would harm us, but we also have to go back to the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, where the tempter takes him to the roof of the temple and says, throw yourself off and God will save you. And Jesus said, it is not appropriate to tempt the Lord your God. So I don't think we should tempt God. So what we're going to ask people to do is to bring elements, bread and grape juice. As you may know, I'm a fan of wine in communion, but at this point I don't want us to run afoul of any of the state's open beverage or open container laws, and so we're asking that you bring grape juice to this communion with bread. And what we will do is we will essentially do what happens at youth gatherings when we get thousands of youth and their leaders together in, say, a stadium, and we have the celebrant lead us in the Eucharist from a central point, a central altar, and yet the communion that is distributed is actually considered to be distributed. It might be up in the top row in the back, and yet it is understood that in that large gathering, that large community of individuals, even though those elements weren't physically manipulated by the celebrant, that they are indeed considered to be consecrated. The same exact thing happens in papal masses, say when the Pope visits Philadelphia and goes to the stadium. Exact same thing. So that is the theological model that we will be operating from at those drive-in services, where myself and a musician will be placed under the portico at the front. We will have communion, but it will be in a way that might seem strange at first. So I hope that this episode of Ask the Pastor has answered your questions. If you have any follow-up questions or any new questions, please feel free, don't hesitate to contact me by text or email or telephone, and I'll put together one of these video responses. In the meantime, stay faithful, stay safe, and may God bless you. Amen.